Good afternoon. I think we might just wait one more minute just to allow people to dial in. Welcome to Macquarie Business School. You joined the Communicating with Impact webinar. And I'm just looking at the number of participants as they are heading in the door. We are expecting over 500 registrations coming in. So if you'd be patient with us as we allow people to just log in. Whilst we wait, it's been a cracker of a day, right? We're broadcasting live from Sydney, Australia. So wherever you are joining us from, I can tell you a quick weather report. In Sydney, it's beautiful. Arabella, you're in Byron, right?
Byron Bay, the most sought after place in Australia. And the weather, I must say, is gorgeous. There are no jumpers here.
No jumpers there, yeah. And how are we going with the registrations? Yep, just a couple more minutes so that people can log in.
I actually did some foundation training on the beach this morning.
Oh, beautiful.
It was
nice. So as we're waiting for other participants to join, there is a quick poll there that we'd ask you to complete, or take you less than a second to complete that, just to give us a bit more of an understanding of our audience today. That foundation training that you did this morning, Arabella, was that a run? Was that interval training? What was that?
It's called foundation training, and it comes from the States, a doctor who was looking at a lot of that opening up of the chest and interacting everything that you do with your computer. It was really difficult.
I bet.
I don't recommend it.
I mean, I think it's really interesting how people prepare themselves mentally and physically, right? And this is sort of like softly related to what we're going to be talking about in terms of communication skills, because it's mental preparation. Whether you do foundation training, whether you go for a walk, whether you get some fresh air or for a run, whatever that is, I think it's important to clear the head, to get the right frame of mind. So how are we going on the participations? I think we've got enough to start. The time is, I think we can start. Welcome. Thank you again for your time in joining us at Macquarie Business School. The topic for our webinar today is Communicating with Impact. My name is Lan Snell. I'm an Associate Professor in Marketing at the Business School. I'm also the Course Director for the Global MBA product, which is a program to which the topic today is associated with. I'd like to introduce our special guests, the creators of this fantastic Communicating with Impact course. It is currently in fact, the most popular course in the Global MBA in the open platform with Coursera, and that is Arabella and Lawrence. So I'll ask Arabella first to introduce herself, and then we'll switch over to Lawrence. Hi.
Hi, Lan. Thank you. Yes, I am a corporate communications coach, and I've been coaching for almost 15 years now, working with CEOs, executives, and senior leadership teams here in Australia, Asia, the UK, and the US. So a lot of my study has been around the brain and how the brain works and how to influence the brain consistently.
Thank you.
Thanks for having
Lawrence,
me.
hi.
Hi. Len is my colleague. I'm teaching at the Department of Marketing at the business school. And my area of specialization is in communication, advertising and communication. So this is a topic that's close to my heart as well.
Thanks. I'm just going to jump back to the poll question that we've got for you. And at the moment, we've got a number of people who've answered that question. And we're sitting at majority of people so far, 33% are alumni. So welcome back to your alma mater. Great to have you with us. The framing for today, how do we communicate with impact? Here's the thing, we're operating in a very crazy COVID world right now, right? Communication, the skill is probably one of the hardest skills. And I don't think you can ever get it right. I think we're always evolving and refining and growing and learning. I think if the moment that you think that you've got it right is the moment that you're ready to depart this earth, right? Because this is all about ongoing learning. Today, we see a number of job losses in Australia. Tragically, this is affecting us. It's a significant effect in terms of the economic and the social impact. I like to think of that on three pillars. One is the COVID has a direct impact on how we work, how we live, and how we learn. And the role of communication in amongst all this from a personal and a professional perspective is really important. So what we're going to do in this next hour, we're going to be very respectful of your time, is to discuss three main areas under communicating with impact. The first is the challenges related to communicating, and we've got some potential solutions to meet that challenge. The second area is all about storytelling, the importance of storytelling. And finally, we're going to share some tips on how to handle objections. How does that sound? Arabella, Lawrence, are you happy to discuss those areas?
Yep, we're in. Yeah. I'm speaking on your part.
Yeah, no choice.
The other thing is that we encourage you to send in your comments and questions along. We'll do our best to address them. If we don't get around to all of them, we'll come back to you post this webinar. This is going to be recorded so that you can access it again, and for those people who can't make it live for the session. So the challenges with communicating. I mean, it's probably one of the hardest skills to do, whether you're doing this on a one-to-one or one-to-many. It's a very hard skill to manage. Here we are communicating via Zoom, right? So we've pivoted very quickly in this COVID world from face-to-face communications or interactions to virtual. But no matter which channel, no matter what delivery channel that you're looking at, we've got to get this right in terms of the preparation and the key messages and outcome to which we're seeking from this. I'm going to hand it over to Arabella. What are your thoughts in terms of the challenges related to communicating?
Yeah, thanks, Lan. I think you were talking earlier about the fact that you've been on so many webinars recently, and a great majority of those webinars haven't been engaging, haven't answered your biggest questions, and haven't given you the tips, tools, or techniques that you need or you thought that you were going to get from the webinar. And so a lot of the clients that I've been working with say to me, it's okay, because once we go back to face-to-face, it'll be different, it'll be better. And I always say to them that if you are communicating online, that it is much, much, much more difficult than communicating face-to-face. And in fact, you need to hone your skills so that you're very tight, you're clear, you're concise, and you know how to influence in every interaction that you have. And then when you go back to face-to-face, you'll be even stronger and even better. So a major challenge is that people don't know what to do in order to be concise, clear, and influential in their interactions.
Mm. And so what we want to avoid is what we're seeing on the slide right now: boredom, fatigue, switching. I mean, right now, a lot of people, we've got about over 100 people who have joined us live for this broadcast. There could be a whole bunch of challenges happening in their household. The kids could be, distracting. You might be thinking about what's for dinner tonight, or take the washing in. A whole bunch, a million different thoughts are in your head. But what we want them to do is be engaged with this conversation. How do we do that? Lawrence, give us some of your insights on this.
Yeah, see, what Arabella talked about is, this difficult period of time. And, you take this as an opportunity, in fact, to hone your skills, right? And it's really important to be able to develop those skills and take this time to actually understand, what is it that you want to communicate. So often, it might come down to be able to tell a story. It could be able to, know what you want them to think, feel, and do, or be able to have the right, anecdotes to be able to bring the narrative around and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of things that we could do, right? So one of the frameworks that Arabella's going to talk about is this idea of think, feel, and do, right? Now, this actually has a history in advertising as well. In advertising, often we say, look, you got to, what we call the cognitive side of things, the brain side of things, so that's thinking. And then you want them to feel really good about your brand. So that's the feeling. And then ultimately, you want them to actually go out and buy something, right? So that's the concept of do. Now, we can take this framework, okay, and then we say we take this framework as a form of guideline, I guess. I say before any meeting, before any seminars, webinars, or any communication, take the time to actually prepare it. What is it that you want your audience to think, how you want them to feel, and ultimately what you want them to do, right? So it's think, feel, and do. I think Arabella has a different perspective that she would elaborate on this.
Yeah, a lot of the interactions that I have with people online, they say to me, we've got back-to-back meetings, and you may feel the same way, that you're spending a lot of time on Zoom or on Microsoft Teams. and that those meetings are not as concise or clear as you want them to be. So you're not getting the outcome that you need or want. And it was funny because I just received an email yesterday from one of my competitors on how to be influential. And I thought it was quite funny. I didn't know how I was on their mailing list, but I am. And it said, number one, the way to be most influential is to be confident. And that's true, but how do you be confident? And these soft skills that we're talking about are actually very practical, because for most people, they're not preparing before they walk into a meeting. And yes, what do you want them to think? You want them to think that it's absolutely crucial that they do what you're asking them to do in order to get what they need and want. And in order to feel, you want them to feel motivated or inspired, because we know that on the whole, people make emotional decisions. If you look at the aviation industry, they've spent millions of dollars researching how pilots make decisions, especially under pressure, because if a pilot crashes a plane, they kill hundreds of people and they ruin a brand. Or not, I still fly Malaysian Air. But also, if you look at the advertising industry, as you would know, Lawrence, they've spent millions of dollars researching how consumers make decisions because they want to influence those decisions. So on the whole, they say that people make emotional decisions, which is post-rationalized with logic. So you still need logic, but in that moment, how do you emotionally connect with that person or group of people? Mm-hmm. Now, in the corporate world and in most of our business lives, we don't connect emotionally because that's not seen as being professional or getting what you need and want in that moment, when in fact, that's where you need to start. And connecting emotionally means that you yourself need to be connected emotionally, but you also need to know what you want them to feel. And then the last part too is, what is that specific action that they will do by the end of that interaction? They won't just, they'll like the idea. So they like the idea, then what do they do? Do they write an email? Do they book in another meeting? What is that very specific action?
So this is book action, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people that I've been talking to, they say, oh, look, we'll just go to the meeting and find out what they want. No, you don't find out what they want. You decide on what you want and go in, and then make sure you have the skills to get it. Of course, we're looking at win-win scenarios.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add that point as well. Often people might say, oh, communication, is a soft skill. But if you want, to accomplish what, Arabella suggests, in fact, it's a core skill. It's a very, very important skill that, many of us do not necessarily have it, right? So it's not a soft skill at all. I mean, advertising industry spends millions of dollars trying to convince you to feel something about a brand so that you ultimately go and buy. That's a really important task, for that particular industry, right? So, and so that concept of think, feel, and do is a nice one for you, to think about the next time, you want, to hold a meeting, or you want to hold a seminar or whatever. So it's an important set of skills.
So the notes that I've been making as I'm listening to both of you share this lovely framework is that 90%, even the whole 80-20% rule applies. 80% of it comes down to preparation, right? It's like when you're painting a wall, most of that time is spent preparing the surface before you actually put on the coat. Okay, so I'm just going to recap the discussion so far. We started out with looking at the challenges related to communication, and that mainly relates to confidence, understanding what you want to get out of it, and all the distractions in between. And then we've talked about how to prepare for a meeting such that you can build that confidence to reach the outcome to which you want to seek. Let's now move on to how do we do that? I mean, we talked a lot about the role of emotions in influencing a decision. And as Arabella said earlier, we're human beings, and so we respond emotionally most of the time. And emotions are best conveyed by stories.
That's right. So in fact, one of this, I guess one of the main tip I guess for this course is to create a narrative, right? Whatever story whatever message you want to do or want to say. First of all, have a narrative, have a storyline that has, a beginning, right, a middle, and an end. So the beginning has to be something where there's a hook, there's something interesting that can grab the audience, right? And then the middle part would be where you spend probably 80% of your time. That's the part where you have a problem solution, some sort of benefit, for the audience. And the end part, okay, is where there's a call to action. So that's the do bit, yeah, right? So at the end of the presentation, you would want your audience to be able to do something, or to inspire to do something, and so forth. So that's the end goal that Arabella talks about, right? You want to do. So by having that sweeping narrative, you can then say, okay, how am I going to structure my speech today? How am I going to structure the webinar today, so that you can grab them at the beginning, have some sort of narrative, some sort of problem solving in the middle, and some sort of ending that can call to action, right? Now you will see this sort of structure being played out by the end of this webinar, right? Now, what's interesting here is that depending on, and this is where I suggest you come and do our course, is because there are many ways of structuring, okay, the story, right? So this is a very simple, 3-part structure, right? Now, the other interesting bit is, of course, you just can't tell the story on its own, right? You got to have some sort of information. So the information is the facts, right? So these are the facts, so you can relate to some factual information. You can relate to some sort of, market share, or something that you want to do, and so forth. So these are real concrete facts, but facts are boring, right? You can never arouse emotions with facts. What you want to do is to be able to weave the facts into the story, right? So story is where it is easiest to create emotions people can follow, and it allows you at certain points in a story to say, no, something happened, and this is what happened, right? And let me tell you, 5 years ago, XYZ happens, and then you link it back to the fact, right? So the stories and fact, you toggle between the stories and the fact, and then you draw out the implications of that, right? You draw out the implications of that. So when you have a problem solution format like that, right, you toggle between the facts, have the stories, what does it imply, and then you go back again to the facts, weave it back with a set of stories, and so forth, right? So it's never facts per se, because facts per se is so boring. And yet sometimes, often we hear from politicians and say, oh, let's stick to the facts, let's keep our emotions out of it, right? But we know, that decisions are made from emotions, by our emotions. It drives our actions, not facts alone, right? So that's something that you want to think about, right? So it's a nice little sort of framework, for you to remember next time.
Can I build on that? Because that's a really good point. You're talking about problem and solution. And what people don't realize about stories is it's one of the most powerful ways to overcome objections or resistance in the other person, because that story serves as a metaphor. What you're doing is taking their problem and you're solving it in a different context. And that's much less confronting. It allows them to reflect on the issue from a different perspective. And it also shifts things in the limbic system, which is that emotional part of the brain, which they make decisions from on the whole. This is a really interesting infographic that I came across, which looks at storytelling and the power of storytelling. And because I was looking at, TED Talks, and 100 of the most viral TED Talks, 65% of them was made up of personal story. And so then I went further, okay, what is in story that makes it so powerful? And what they found is that when you tell a story, neural coupling starts happening, which means that you start to feel like the protagonist in the story. So when the person said, I was down at the shops, then you start imagining that you're down at the shops, or and then this car came in front of me, and you start to imagine everything exactly as the storyteller. Mirroring starts to happen with your neurons, which means they start to wire and fire in the same way as the speaker. So if they're emotionally connected, then you start to feel those same emotions. Dopamine is released, that feel-good chemical. As soon as we start to hear stories, we relax and we start to produce dopamine into the brain, which means we, as human beings, we're tribal. We learn through stories. We love stories. As soon as the story starts, we're ready to hear that story. And the cortex activity, we know that from facts and data, about 1 to 2 parts of the brain lights up. Whereas if you're telling a story, 7 to 8 parts of the brain light up. So it engages much more of the brain. So for example, if you're talking about this morning, I was down at Byron Bay on the beach doing foundation training as the sun rose, and we had to strengthen certain parts of our body. Now we start to use our motor cortex. That starts to light up as we start to think about our own muscles. So yeah, it's really interesting. People overlook stories. Why would I tell stories? And why would I tell a personal story, much less? But it's in fact very powerful. Lan, can I tell a story about one of my clients? Is that? Yeah, well, I was talking to one of my clients, and he was about to do an update for his whole company, and I said, "So what story are you going to tell?" And he's like, "You're not going to break me." And I said, "I'm not here to break you. I'm just here to walk alongside you. What story are you going to tell?" And he said, "Well, I had this violin and I dropped it 2 days before my exam at the conservatorium, and it broke in the neck, the one place where you can't break a violin." And he said, and then he went on to do his presentation. And then at the end of the presentation, he said, "I went to pick up that violin to see if it was okay to play so that I could sell it, because it cost the deposit of a small house. And when I picked it up, it was richer and more beautiful and more sonorous than it had ever been before." Now, he did that as part of his update to the whole company. And all the women in the audience were crying. And over the next 3 days of that company offsite, all anyone could talk about was this person and their story. And he got promoted to second in command, and he was asked to do all of the media for the whole of APAC. And then he was headhunted to another company in Asia. And when he went to do his second presentation, I said, "So what's your story?" He said, "I'm not doing another story." I said, "Okay, fine." But the impact is quite significant. People don't realize it.
Look, and stories are very powerful, but I also want to raise the dark side of storytelling as well, as humans, because because of the power of a story. It can be used for good, and it also can be used for the flip side of the good, and that is to seduce and to get us into a situation where we may not be otherwise wanting to be. So let's think of some case studies where the flip side might also apply, but still speaks to the power of stories, right? Any ideas, any sort of case studies that we can sort of share about what is the dark side of storytelling?
I mean, the most recent example, well, not recent now, I think this person by the name of Elizabeth Holmes from Terranor. So she came out with this idea of a blood test. So you know how when you have to go for a blood test, you need to, go to and get the syringes, of blood and so forth. So she came out with this method, so-called method, that all you need, okay, is a prick, okay, of blood. So in other words, you go to her, you get a, prick there. It's a small drop of blood, and then drop of blood is capable of, I think, testing something like 150 different diseases and so forth, right? And
quite a smart idea.
A whole health check in a pinprick, essentially, right?
Exactly. So in other words, it's not painful, right? Compared to, say, the normal method, right? But except that it's not true, right? But she managed to convince, and she started with this idea of a story that, my uncle died from cancer, I didn't get to see it, and so forth. So she weaved all her personal stories into it, right? And she managed to get funding, right? And she was very charismatic, and she modeled herself after Steve Jobs of Apple. She even looked like, she has the picture of her with that small, what do you call it, the tube, That's right, the Steve Jobs and so forth, right? And so that was kind of powerful enough for her to actually attract funding, in fact, distribution. And of course, it doesn't work, and then of course, the whole thing came crashing down. But I'm quite amazed that she managed to, get investors, to actually invest in her company.
So a couple of messages from this is the importance of the pitch, right? So she got a whole bunch of very influential people to back her almost all the way, and through this lovely story. The thing is, she was a young female, a dropout from Stanford, even added more street cred to her profile, being a dropout rather than a completed student. And everyone wanted her to succeed. This is like this willingness for her to succeed. We wanted to believe in this next innovation in terms of health. The story was perfect. Her delivery was perfect. The unfortunate thing is it just wasn't true.
Yes.
So the element of trust here, I mean, we've got you. We're trusting you all the way through. We want you to succeed. But that's where the betrayal comes in, and that's where the hurt comes in, because we were with you all the way and yet you sold us a lemon. So the dark side of storytelling also applies. I'm sorry, Arabella, you wanted to say something.
Oh, well, I suppose it's with storytelling, but it's with all of these techniques. I constantly see people with a bad idea who is an excellent influencer win over someone with an amazing idea who hasn't got those communication skills. So it's a mission of ours to make sure that the people with the great ideas are getting supported. There are a few questions here, Lan. And one of them is how to determine the best story to communicate your idea or solution to a client. And that's a great question. With this, it's always looking at what is the problem that we need to solve for the client? What is their biggest issue, or what are they resisting the most in accepting my idea, which I know will help them? Always making sure that we're going for win-win scenarios. And part of that is just making sure that you are so clear that you understand what their biggest issues are. And there's a whole segment in the storytelling, in the Communicate with Impact, on how to find out what their biggest issues are. Because that, if you don't understand what their biggest issues are, then you can't construct a story to overcome that biggest issue.
Often when you want to find a story, find something that is, first of all, it has to be relevant, right? Okay, if it's not relevant, then you're going to lose the audience, right? But then you construct your stories where you have some aspects of, the human truth in it, either in terms of time, in terms of place, and so forth, right? So, but very, very important, it has to be relevant, or else you're going to lose the audience. So the whole idea is to have this, bring the audience with you as you tell your story, as you try, to pitch it, right? So that's very, very crucial.
Which comes back to preparation, doing your research, doing your preparation. And someone said to me the other day, they said, look, I just don't have time to prepare for meetings. And I said, yeah, you may as well do 20 bad meetings over one really good one. I was being a bit farcical, but the whole point being that even if you have 5 minutes to prepare for a meeting, and you have a process to follow, then you're going to be much more deliberate in that outcome.
What's the other interesting aspect to that is often you would lose the opportunity as well, because if you don't prepare yourself, right? Okay, and the audience is there, or the person you want to influence is there, and you stuff it up, right? So that means you lose the opportunity to try to regain it, and that takes twice the effort.
Yes.
Right? You would be better, in fact, to spend a little bit more time upfront, okay, preparing, right, learning the objections and how to handle objections, which Arabella will talk to us later on, right? And then be ready, all right? Prep it, right? And then you have one hit, okay? You have one chance, right? And then go for it. I think that's probably a better way of thinking than say, oh, well, blah, 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 and then you're wasting everybody's time.
It does depend on the stakes, though, as well. So effort for the ratio effort for yield comes in terms of how we apply that. There's a couple of questions within a similar sort of genre. So one of the other questions is what is the best way to handle outcomes? Well, fears while storytelling, and that comes back to confidence. That comes back to preparation, which is the underlying thing across all these things. Let's just move on to the next slide now. Sorry, Ariel, what did you want to say?
Yeah, so when overcoming fears, and that's a really big one. And when I first started coaching, I remember, oh my gosh, I was coaching, years ago in front of a big corporation that you all know. You're probably using one of their software on your computer. And I remember my knee was shaking so much, and I was talking to them about confidence. It was 13 years ago. And I realized that, those nerves come up as soon as you start to speak, because you're scared of not being good enough and being rejected. And that's a very real fear, because we're tribal. We come from tribes. And if you're rejected from your tribe, that meant almost certain death, because you couldn't survive without your tribe. So we just acknowledging, number one, I'm going to be nervous. That's really very powerful. And knowing what you do when you get nervous, because we go into fight, flight, freeze response. Do you start breathing quickly? Does your face go red? Do you start sweating? What happens? And thirdly, the way to counteract it is, yes, as Lan said, exactly, preparation is huge, but also when you're telling stories, I find that if it's a personal story, which are the most powerful because you experienced it, if you are to tell someone else's story, make sure that it has emotionally impacted you. You can tell other people's stories, but you're just going to make sure that it has emotionally impacted you because you want to connect emotionally to have the effect on your audience. But when you're telling your own story, you can't get it wrong. You just can't get a story wrong because it happened to you and you know what happened. And if you relive it as you tell it, then it can be very, very powerful. But it does take confidence and it does take preparation.
Indeed, indeed. And also context matters. Because, you know, we're all really interested in understanding your personal story, but in a meeting, if you've got half an hour, that may not be the place for it as well. So I think you need to exercise judgment in contextually doesn't make sense as well, because there's no doubt people will be interested in the story, but that may not be necessarily the place for that story to happen, to be told at that time. So this slide here is about however, these are what we call objections, right? So this is what Arabella was talking about, our fear, a very primal fear of being rejected as humans, because we want to feel a sense of belonging. We want people to agree with what we're saying. And yet a lot of the times we're constructing a story or a pitch to try and get them to do this and to agree with us. Yet a lot of the times they're doing this. Most of the time they're disagreeing with what we're saying. It's a human thing. No, don't like the idea. We're too busy, don't have enough money, etc., etc. So how do we overcome these objections?
Really, really good question. And it's what people fear the most is, oh my God, I hope they don't talk about the budget or resources, or I hope they don't ask this one thing. And they walk into meetings frightened that someone's going to object to one thing in particular or many things. Whereas as human beings, statistically, we will object 5 to 7 times before we buy anything. And when I say buy anything, I mean buy an idea, buy a product, a service, a strategy. So people are going to object. And in fact, an objection is a wonderful thing because it means that they are now interacting with you and you have an opportunity to find out what's really going on for them and what issues are coming up for them. And you object too when you're about to buy anything. So making sure that you have prepared, gone through, okay, what are the objections that they may come up with? What might prevent them from accepting my idea in this moment? And they'll usually be around 5 to 10 maximum. There's not going to be that many. And if you prepare a way of dealing with them, then I think we've got 25 plus ways of dealing with objections in the course, Lan.
Yeah. And the other thing I really liked what you said earlier is that, you know, I don't actually see objections as a negative thing. So, you know, we're academics, right? We call this critical discussion. So we're actually trained to see and to assess things holistically and to pick out and be devil's advocate in most things. This is not to object for the sake of it, but to really make sure it's a rigorous process. This is what we do. This is critical discussion. So I don't think we should think about objection in a negative way, but rather in the way you phrased earlier, Arabella, is an opportunity to engage on specific things to get to that outcome. Because, you know, presumably we all want to reach Rome, whatever Rome is for you. So together, how do we do it? If we unpack those pieces and understand what those perceived hurdles are on the way, we could get to that. That path may be a bit zigzag, but we can get to it. So how do we do it? How do we do it, Ryan?
Well, the funniest thing was I was on the phone the other day and a telecommunications provider that you probably know called me up and said, "Hi, Arabella, we see that you, how are you?" And I said, "I'm good. I'm just really busy. I'm about to do a meeting in 20 minutes and I've got a paper to prepare." And the person on the end said, "I see that you're really busy. You've got a paper to prepare. And it's in 20 minutes. I said, yes. And he said, "So you've got your internet and phone with us?" And I said, "Yes, I've got internet and phone." He said, "And how are you finding them?" I said, "Actually really bad. I can't upload or download things very quickly. I have to go to my friend's place if I'm uploading a video. It's very, very frustrating. He said, I see how frustrating that is. You can't upload things quickly and you have to go to your friend's place. And that's really frustrating for you. And I said, yeah, it is. And he goes, okay, so we've got a new solution. I said, hang on, did you just use ARM? And he said, no, sorry, what? I said, did you use ARM? Acknowledge, reassure, move on. I said, you did it twice. And he goes, no, I just get on really well with him. I said, no, you just used ARM. And he said, okay, I used ARM. And it was one of the best examples of someone using acknowledge, reassure, move on. Because for most objections, and I know this is going to sound controversial, but there is a way of acknowledging them just so that they're heard and then moving on. Here is another set of ways that you can deal with objections. And one is called the agreement frame. Now, I'll ask you, which word am I avoiding? But the agreement frame is when you disagree with what someone's saying. However, you need to help them feel heard and then pivot them or get them to change direction. And so you might say to them, I appreciate what you're saying. And then you might use the third frame there, which is the what if frame. What if we were to look at this way? What would happen if we did it this way? I appreciate what you're saying, or I respect what you're saying, or I agree with what you're saying, which of course you'd only use if you did, in fact, agree. But what is the word that we're avoiding? I appreciate what is it?
But.
Yes.
However.
And we're avoiding the energy of but. You really want to empathize with people when they have an objection, and you really want to see it from their perspective and say, I appreciate that. And what if we were to do this? And so that you're open, they're open, and you're having a discussion about coming to a conclusion.
I love the word and because I mean it's so inclusive.
Yeah.
Isn't it? And it's not binary, so it's almost like it's the all thing is it's this or this, but why can't we do both? Or why can't you choose what you want? And let them come up with that solution themselves, right? So if you've just articulated some possible avenues for them to consider, and you're still having this open dialogue, and yet the whole sophistication in this framework, Arabella, is that you're flipping it so that they're in charge of the conversation, and therefore they feel that they can chart what that is, but the outcome is still reached, and so that looks like success all around, right? It's a very artful way of actually negotiating.
Yeah, and the second frame there as well is the purpose frame. And this is really important because sometimes you think you understand what their objection is and you actually don't. And so we ask the question, for what purpose? Or how is that a problem? How is that a problem? To really get down to what the core problem is. Because if you assume what the problem is, you may be solving a problem that isn't a problem at all.
90% of the case, that's a case, right?
Don't get me started, laugh. That's not what I'm asking.
Yeah. It's just like, that's why we work. We go to work because we solve problems that aren't really there. We're not really there to solve the root cause of the problem. Lawrence, what do you think about all this?
I think it's brilliant, because I think in the course we actually did a case study where you have a hostage situation where you actually have to negotiate your way out of it. You know, the guy is about to kill somebody, right? So that's, and they have something like 99% success rate. Those fantastic negotiators use those techniques that Arabella talks about. All right, and it is especially challenging as well because the guy is about to shoot the person, right? And you got to be able to negotiate, and those are in fact even more challenging than what you see in real life, in the business world. I mean, so yeah, so this is extremely important. But just coming back to this idea of objections, yes, I think very often because we are social animals, we want to be loved all the time, right? We want to be adored, we want to be praised, and so forth, right? But in business and in some situations like the hostage situation, right, you have to be able to deal with difficult conversation. You got to be able to deal with it, right? And that's why I say it's not a soft skill. It is a hardcore skill. Lives are on the line in this case, right? So,
well, luckily in the business world, we're not really dealing with those sort of life and death moments. I mean, those guys are, they're pretty skillful negotiators there because of the impact is much higher. But the politics still exist in any organisation, and we still need to sort of try and communicate and deliver some sort of impact with those scenarios. I'm just wondering if we can turn our attention to some of the questions that have come in here. So there's a question here, there's a term called persuasive storytelling. What do you think of it? I might throw this to Arabella. Persuasive storytelling, isn't storytelling persuasive? What do you think?
What do I think of persuasive storytelling? I think storytelling can be one of the most persuasive tools that you can use. And the reason being is that when someone is resisting what you're saying, usually their neocortex, so their facts, data, logic part of their brain, is saying, no, that's not possible. No, I can't do that. Time, money, budget, resources. They're coming up with a lot of resistance from their thinking part of their brain. So you need to disable their thinking or their neocortex part of the brain. And what telling a story does is it takes them into a different part of the brain. And already they're disengaging with the facts, data, logic, and they're starting to engage on a deeply unconscious level, because the limbic system, where you tell stories to, is part of the unconscious brain. Now, that's where you start to embed messages and deep into their recesses that they will remember and recall later.
Yes.
Why? Because the limbic system is where we store long-term memories. It's not only where we feel emotions, but it's where we store images, and we get them to picture things through our words. So persuasive storytelling, I'm all for it. You just need to know how to do it well. The first place to start is just practicing, just telling stories with your friends, your family. You already do it. You already do it.
Yeah, so the principle of persuasion is often what you want is to get the audience to accept your message, right? And often the audience may not accept your message because there's a lot of resistance. So one way of overcoming those resistance is to transport them into another time, another place. And that's where, story becomes important. And that's where the emotions, you can embed all those emotions, and they can, you can overcome those natural resistance somebody might have against your story, right? So you go beneath their resistance, and then you then sell the message that way. So that's another way of looking at it. Yeah.
So here's the thing, and I'll put it to both you, Arabella and Lawrence, is that as human beings, we are naturally resistant. We're naturally change resistant. We do not like change. No matter what that rhetoric says that, we're going to have to change this, and change is obviously the only constant in life. We still don't like it. We don't like dealing with unknowns. And so if that is the current state that we must first accept already. We're very change resistant to begin with. Yeah. And so how do we dismantle that and get through that is a challenge, right?
So in the MBA, we put in a specific set of skills called the Milton model, which is one of the most powerful sets of skills to overcome the critical brain and embed messages into the unconscious, of course, for win-win scenarios. And one of the techniques there is called a mind read, where you say, I know, I can tell, I'm sure. Now, this is a technique that you'll already be using. How many of you have said, I know you're really busy, or I can tell you want to get this sorted quickly, or I'm sure we can find a solution together? And learning specific techniques like that and layering them one on top of the other means that by the end of it, there's no way out. It's very powerful. I sat down with a CEO last year and had a sales conversation with him. By the end of it, he said, I don't know what you did, but I want to learn all of it. And that's what we've put into this MBA, is every single one of those skills that you layer on top of each other. But the biggest issue is that people don't understand the brain. They don't understand how to influence it, and they don't know how to do it consistently. And it's actually quite straightforward. It's mathematical, it's logical, and you just need to implement those skills.
I call it the nodding principle. I mean, I'm not trained in your area, Arabella. This is not my space, but I do call it the nodding principle, and that is you want people to do this all the way, because when you do ask for that spinal close, they're still doing this. It's really hard for them to do this because all along they've been doing this. So at the final close, because you've been placing those seeds all along, because you've been using those techniques and they're agreeing all the way, it's illogical for them to disagree at the end.
Yeah.
So
Lawrence and I do an activity in the MBA where it's called matching, which many of you may have heard of before, where you match the other person physically and vocally 60%, not 100%. That has the reverse effect. I have seen it done before. But yes, you match them physically and vocally 60%, because if we look at communication and building rapport where someone knows, likes and trusts you on a deep unconscious level, where they are willing to accept your ideas uncritically, it's made up of 3 components, and 55% of that is body language, 38% is vocal tone, and only 7% are words. So 93% of building rapport initially and having an emotional connection is through how you speak. Now, one of the questions was, what are the challenges that we're having at the moment, is that when you are online, you've no longer got that energetic exchange that you do when you're in person. And so your other senses have to become even more heightened. How do I physically adapt to the people I'm seeing? Or if they have no video, how can I listen to them and adapt to what they're saying so that we're physically and vocally connecting on a deep unconscious level?
So I use Twitter quite a lot. And one of the people I follow, her name is Sarah Cooper. I'm not sure if you're aware of her. She's so clever. She's a comedian. And she just on that whole thing about body language, mirroring and audio. So obviously we're in the absence of a physical interaction, we're not in the same room, we've got this cue here, but at least we can still see each other, at least we can still use our body language to emphasize or place nuances on things. She's gone one step further and she's just isolated the audio. She's used Trump's audio and placed her comedic voiceover, and she does this sort of lip sync to Trump, and it's very clever because she's a Black American woman and she's doing this lip sync to Trump, and really the message what she's trying to get here is how ridiculous that particular statement is. It's very clever, but the point here in me sharing this story is that she's just using one cue, and that is audio. So we're just looking at different layers. Here we are interacting via Zoom, and it's, this is actually quite taxing to do. I'm sure most people who have dialed into this webinar have had at least 3 to 4, if not more, Zoom sessions today, of which some have been fairly engaging and some have been pretty downright boring and disengaging. But it is a very taxing vehicle for us to try and be animated all the time.
Yeah. If you look at the work that's being done by, for example, a lot of the companies that have been remote working, or they call it distributed work teams, for the last decade, and they've written books, for example, Basecamp and WordPress, they've had fully distributed teams the whole time. And they talk about a new way of working, which is not having a video call after video call after video call, because it starts to be very ineffective, and in fact changing the decision-making process to writing long form what your point is and then asking other people to comment on it over the next 24 hours. And it might take longer to come to a decision, but you're allowing people to reflect on the information they're getting rather than having to react in a very short period of time where one person may be very prepared and all the others are simply jumping in, doing what they need to in that moment.
That, I think, that comes from either Amazon or Tesla. So that was their work practice there. So they had these, it's a certain work practice, and they can't come to this meeting unless, and the outcome for this meeting is a decision, and they all wear this decision. So they come in prepared, having read that same material and be prepared to discuss, but they'll walk out with an agreed decision. It's not about unanimous. It's about actually saying, okay, this is what we're going to accept as a responsibility. So changing work practice is interesting. Sorry, Lawrence.
Yeah, I just want to jump in there. I think that's a very, very important point. Often we come to the meetings unprepared, And in fact, studies after studies have shown that in fact, brainstorming as a technique does not work. It does not work because people who come to the brainstorming sessions do not prepare. So as a result, the dynamics within the brainstorming is extremely important if you want it to work. So the best way to do that is for each group member to actually prepare themselves first and say, okay, what are the issues here, etc., etc. You know, the sort of things that we talked about, right? And then you come to the brainstorming meeting already, and then you systematically go around the table, systematically analyze the ideas and so forth. That actually works. Is when you don't prepare yourself and you just come in and then all hell break loose, and then you end up, you know, wasting everybody's time. So that's a very, very good point, actually.
Yeah, so I mean, it's pretty unproductive. Here we are in a situation, certainly at a university level, where we've been having to respond to this unprecedented situation and trying to design learning experiences that are going to be optimal from the receiver end. And that is all about pedagogic, which is based on flipped learning principles. And so we expect, and this comes back to the point about preparation and the best utilization of that time. We expect students to come prepared to class to engage in a particular discussion, and we unpack it. And so that's where the real learning comes in. And I just want to tie that back to the original principle of this whole topic, which is about communicating with impact, rests upon us being prepared. Our preparation, our practice makes us feel a bit more confident. I like to use the word efficacious, and self-efficacy builds every time. We're never masters. If you know, again, come back into positioning point, we're never masters. It's always a journey, and that journey is best realized if you walk that journey and experience. I come back to your example, Arabella, of the violin. It's a richer journey if you experience failure along the way as well. You know. So I just want us to bring us to a final slide that we've got to share with you. And that is really about this topic. Communicate with Impact is one of the most popular courses on Coursera. At the business school, we offer a program called Global MBA, and this is structured around what we call 6 future-focused capabilities. Influencing is one of those capability sets, of which the Communicate with Impact unit is part of that. You can see the stats here. Let's go to the stats and let's recall how effective these stats are. But you can see that it is the most popular course. It's got over 16,000 people that have enrolled in it. It's the highest rated unit, and you can see the quality with Arabella and Lawrence as the creators of this course. It's not a surprise at all. We've also had another webinar recently on the importance of communication, again, but in a different context. It was in the context of health and COVID. We had members of the task force share the importance of communicating health messages in a time of a pandemic. And again, the overall messages came back. This is one about consistency, clarity, and compassion, particularly with a health pandemic. So I hope that you enjoyed, got some takeaways. We talked about the challenges related to communication, and that was underpinned by preparation, and that will build confidence. We talked about the importance of storytelling and connection, and we talked about how to handle objections. Arabella and Lawrence shared some frameworks for you to consider, and hopefully you can go about and practice that. I'm going to ask both of our speakers just to share their final thoughts before we close off. So Arabella.
Wrapping up communication.
Yeah.
You're very, very good at the task that you do. You're trained, you've done university, you've done many years in what it is that you are earning a living from. However, your ability to communicate what you do or negotiate or influence around what you do is often a skill that's left off the curriculum, and I'm not sure why. And in fact, with a lot of my clients, probably the second or third session, we start talking about their personal relationships at home. So it is a set of skills that is very powerful and necessary no matter what you're doing.
Thank you. Lawrence.
Do the course. I have 3 words for you. After that, practice, practice, and practice.
Yeah.
No, they're really good advice. I want to thank you all again for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it. It will be recorded so you can tap into that, and have a fantastic evening or morning from wherever you're calling from. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arabella.
Thank you.
Lawrence.
Okay.